Imagine a city not of life but of silence. Stone houses where no laughter stirs. Churches where prayers have turned into whispers and taverns stand empty, their wine undrunk. The people of medieval Europe watched their world collapse around them, and yet something stranger happened too. Love changed, desire shifted, and the quiet act of intimacy became something else entirely. Because when death lingers outside your door, the way you live inside your home begins to twist. And in the shadows of plague-stricken cities, medieval men and women found themselves doing something unexpected. They rewrote the rules of desire. Before we begin, let me ask gently, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop a quiet comment below. I always love to know where these sleepy stories find their listeners. And while you're here, please take a moment to gently like this video, leave a thoughtful comment, and subscribe for more slow, calming explorations of history's strangest corners. Your quiet support helps us keep telling these stories softly. Now, let us return to those streets. The Black Death, the most devastating pandemic Europe had ever known. Between 1347 and 1353, plague tore through cities and villages alike. Doctors failed, priests fled, families collapsed, and yet behind locked doors, life of a kind continued. But what happened to intimacy in such a world? What happened to love when bodies piled in the streets? Did people stop, or did they crave closeness even more? Today, we begin to explore that quiet question, but not all at once, because the truth, as we'll see, is complicated. In the coming sections, we'll gently unfold how plague didn't just change survival, it changed bodies, rituals, and even desire itself. We'll ask, why did medieval people fear physical closeness, yet seek it anyway? How did public laws reshape private acts? Why did prostitutes flourish during the deadliest years of the plague? And what strange, desperate habits grew behind the walls of plague-ridden homes? But those answers must wait. For now, picture a medieval city under plague. A place where silence rules, but desire lingers. And as we walk these empty streets, remember, even in history's darkest hours, human nature does not vanish. It adapts. Sleep softly, dear listener. Our quiet exploration has only just begun. Why fear made people desire more? When we imagine a plague-stricken medieval city, desire is not the first thing we think of. After all, what could lust mean when death waits outside every door? And yet, something curious happened. As fear spread, desire didn't vanish, it grew. Why? Let us step softly through the empty streets and explore how fear, deep, constant, and unrelenting, changed not just survival, but intimacy itself. Because in medieval cities, when life became uncertain, bodies drew closer, not out of hope, but out of desperation. The logic of fear. Fear, in its simplest form, should drive people apart, and for a time it did. At the start of each plague wave, people locked their doors, families isolated, strangers avoided each other in the street, touch itself became dangerous. Doctors advised avoiding even conversation, believing the breath of another could bring death. And yet human nature strained against this logic, because fear, left unchecked, doesn't just lead to caution, it leads to craving. When life became uncertain, people wanted what was forbidden. When death circled the city, people wanted proof they were still alive. Desire was no longer pleasure, it was proof of survival. When the churches closed. In times of plague, medieval churches often closed their doors. Priests died or fled, services stopped, confessions were no longer heard. For many, religion had been the boundary between sin and virtue, between indulgence and restraint. When churches closed, that boundary vanished. Who would judge? Who would forgive? And for many, the absence of judgment was freedom. Men who once sought blessings now sought comfort. Women who once prayed for marriage now craved closeness, however brief. The plague, in silencing religion, unlocked something else, the collapse of restraint. When even God seemed absent, pleasure felt like the last rebellion, and perhaps the last comfort. The rise of fatalism. Medieval cities lived with death, but the Black Death changed its shape. Death was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. People watched neighbors collapse in streets, saw friends buried without prayers, heard the carts rolling past, collecting bodies. And when death becomes certain, choices shift. For many, the question was no longer, what should I avoid? It became, what should I do before I die? In taverns, once closed, people gathered again. In private homes, doors unlocked. And in brothels, business returned. Because fear, over time, breeds fatalism. And fatalism breeds indulgence. If tomorrow brings death, why not feel something tonight? Desire as rebellion. For some, physical closeness became something more than survival. It became rebellion, a rejection of death's shadow. In every kiss, every touch, every whispered promise, people fought back against what surrounded them, not with swords, but with bodies. Desire, in the time of plague, was not about passion, it was about control. A moment stolen from fear, a night stolen from silence, and in the minds of many, perhaps their last chance. The body as comfort. But beyond rebellion, there was something simpler. The body became comfort. When the air smelled of death, when the streets echoed with silence, when even prayers felt unanswered. A hand on the shoulder, a head against a chest, a night spent not alone. These were not acts of lust, they were acts of survival. Desire in its simplest form is the need to be touched, and in plague cities, touch was both forbidden and necessary. People craved it not for pleasure, but for proof they were not alone. In a world where death came quietly, being held became life itself. Did this mean love? Not often. These connections were not romantic. They were not built on affection. They were built on fear, on desperation, on the human need to be near another when the world collapses. In some cases, perhaps love followed, but mostly these were transactions of survival. Desire without feeling, pleasure without hope, a comfort not of the heart, but of the body, and yet no less human. The return of brothels. As the plague spread, many expected brothels to close forever. After all, who would visit such places when even neighbors avoided each other? But the opposite happened. Brothels at first shuttered, soon reopened, not secretly, but publicly, and not because society approved, but because society needed them. In cities stripped of joy, brothels offered something different, routine. A place where clients knew what to expect, a place where women, too, craved the familiarity of their work. Brothels became, in the strangest way, sanctuaries, not from sin, but from fear. And in those small, shadowed rooms, desire returned, not as luxury, but as survival, for both the client and the worker. Desire changed, but it did not die. The plague changed everything. Cities fell silent, markets closed, churches emptied. But desire? Desire adapted. It became quieter, darker, less about pleasure, more about proof. Proof that life still flickered, that death had not yet won. And as medieval cities drowned in ash and silence, their people clung to each other, not out of love, but out of need. A simple, desperate need not to die alone.
In the next section, we will step carefully into the spaces where these needs were met: brothels, taverns, private homes, and will ask the quiet question, who profited when fear became desire? But that story, dear listener, waits patiently in the next chapter.
Who profited from fear? Brothels, taverns, and quiet transactions. Let us step deeper now into the empty streets and shuttered homes of plague-stricken cities. Behind locked doors, behind whispers and fear, life continued, and yet some places, curiously, thrived. Not the churches, not the marketplaces, but elsewhere, in places quieter, darker, and far more transactional. Brothels, taverns, private rooms where coin and comfort exchanged hands. Because as fear gripped medieval cities, it was not priests or physicians who found opportunity. It was the sellers of comfort. And so we ask, who profited when fear changed the shape of desire? Today, let us follow the quiet sound of coins changing hands and understand how plague did not stop pleasure, it sold it. The rebirth of brothels. At the beginning of plague outbreaks, brothels were among the first spaces closed. City officials, fearing contagion, ordered shutters drawn, doors locked, women sent home. But as months passed, something strange happened. Brothels reopened, and not in secret, in the open. Because as fear changed the shape of intimacy, cities quietly decided that controlled desire was safer than uncontrolled desperation. Licensed brothels, taxed and supervised, became necessary. Without them, clandestine meetings multiplied. Disease, ironically, spread faster without official brothels. And so governments themselves allowed these places to operate. Women returned to their narrow rooms, coins exchanged hands, and the city's quiet, fearful desires were once again contained. Who benefited? Not the women. Most prostitutes were still slaves or impoverished women, trapped in their work out of necessity. But their owners, their managers, their pimps, they profited, even during plague, perhaps especially during plague. Each coin paid by a desperate client went not to the woman, but to the man who owned the building, controlled the space, managed the business. In some cases, city officials themselves took a share. Brothel taxes, after all, funded public work. And so in plague-stricken cities, officials quietly allowed suffering so long as it paid. Taverns and transactional spaces. And it wasn't just brothels. Taverns, too, reopened, not for joy, but for survival. People needed somewhere to gather, somewhere to find comfort, and taverns, like brothels, were places of both transaction and intimacy. In taverns, food was scarce, wine scarcer, but what was sold most often? Rooms, a rented bed, a private space. Transactions once confined to brothels now occurred in back rooms. Tavern owners profited. Privacy became a commodity. Fear drove people together, and tavern keepers knew it. Coins bought not just a drink, they bought closeness. Private transactions behind closed doors. For those who could not afford brothels or taverns, private rooms became places of transaction. In rented spaces, in small homes, women worked quietly. No records, no supervision, no taxes. For many women, this was not empowerment, it was vulnerability. Without legal protection, even the small protections brothels offered, they were at risk. Yet many preferred this to the control of brothel owners.
And in these private, hidden spaces, fear was both their greatest danger and their greatest advertisement. People sought them out, not for luxury, but for the quiet, desperate comfort they offered. Survival became business. In plague cities, survival itself became a commodity, a moment of comfort, a night spent not alone, a whispered promise of closeness, however brief. All these were sold, because when life felt certain to end, pleasure was not indulgence, it was necessity, and those who could sell it profited. Brothel owners, tavern keepers, landlords renting rooms by the hour, and even city officials taking their share through taxes. Fear, as it turned out, was good for business. Did the women profit? For most, no. They worked longer hours, saw more desperate clients, faced greater danger, and yet their pay remained the same or less. But for some, small victories remained possible. A familiar client, a safer transaction, a night where survival felt slightly more certain. And in rare cases, women who worked independently kept their own coins. But these were exceptions. For most, their labor funded someone else's wealth. As plague emptied cities, it filled the pockets of those who sold what fear demanded. Why society allowed it? Because brothels, taverns, and private spaces offered control. Desperate men needed somewhere to go. Desperate women needed somewhere to work. And society, unwilling to face its own fears, turned a blind eye. Better to let transactions continue quietly than risk chaos. Pleasure controlled fear. Commerce controlled pleasure. And in this silent exchange, cities found fragile stability. Conclusion: when fear becomes profit. In the end, plague did not kill desire. It sold it. In brothels where women waited for clients they no longer chose. In taverns where back rooms became spaces of transaction. In private homes where desperation whispered louder than death itself. And behind each of these doors, coins changed hands, not for love, not even for lust, but for survival. And those who controlled the spaces controlled the city. Fear changed desire, desire became business, and business in plague-stricken cities never truly closed. In the next section, we will step into these hidden spaces, not to judge, but to understand what intimacy truly looked like in the age of death. Because behind locked doors, history's strangest survival strategies unfolded. And that quiet story, dear listener, waits patiently in the next chapter.
Behind locked doors, what intimacy looked like in the age of death. Let us step softly now through doorways long closed. Behind locked doors, beyond the silence of plague-filled streets, life continued, but not the life people once knew. Intimacy itself, the simplest human connection, changed shape. What happened when fear rewrote desire? When every touch carried risk? When the church stopped watching and the doctors stopped caring? Today, we step inside the homes, the brothels and the tavern rooms of medieval cities, and we ask, what did intimacy truly look like in the age of death? Private acts in public fear. In a world consumed by plague, privacy was paradoxical. On the one hand, fear drove people into isolation. Doors were locked, windows shuttered. families sealed themselves away. But inside those homes, people remained human. Husbands and wives, once distanced by fear, found themselves unable to resist the need for closeness, not out of romance, but out of craving. When the streets outside fell silent, the sound of another person breathing became a comfort. And behind locked doors, intimacy became two things at once, a risk and a necessity. Routine became ritual. Before the plague, physical closeness was ordinary, a hug, a shared bed, a hand on the shoulder. But during the plague, each of these acts became deliberate, ritualized, a decision. Do we touch? Do we share a meal? Do we sleep beside one another tonight? In homes across medieval cities, couples negotiated intimacy in ways they never had before. Desire was no longer assumed, it was questioned. Every act of closeness was calculated, and when it happened, it carried more meaning, not because it was romantic, but because it was dangerous. And yet many chose to risk it, because to avoid all closeness was its own kind of death. The work of prostitutes changed. In brothels and private rooms, prostitutes adapted too. Their work became more than service, it became routine. Clients sought not variety, but familiarity. Not pleasure, but predictability. Regular clients were safer. Women encouraged the same men to return. Transactions were calmer, quieter. Conversations replaced performances. In many cases, the physical acts themselves were secondary. People paid not just for bodies, they paid for presence, for a shared space, for a night spent not alone. The transaction remained, but its purpose shifted. And in this shift, prostitutes, many of them women without freedom, found their work strangely humanized, not easier, not kinder, but less performative. Because when death loomed outside the door, pretense became exhausting. Inside the stone rooms, routine became survival, and survival sometimes felt like comfort. Intimacy became transactional everywhere. But it wasn't just prostitutes. In private homes, intimacy itself became transactional. A wife might sleep beside her husband not out of affection, but for warmth. A man might pay a woman not just for service, but for the familiarity of conversation. Affection became currency, not in the romantic sense, but in the survival sense. You give me presence, I give you safety, for one more night. In a world where death waited outside the door, physical closeness became the last trade people were willing to make, not because they wanted to, but because they needed to. Did anyone find love? Perhaps. But love, in the way we imagine it, became a luxury. What people sought was not passion, not romance, but quiet certainty. Someone's whose face they recognized, someone's whose voice they remembered, someone who could remind them that life, however fragile, still lingered. Love, as poets describe it, vanished. What remained was something simpler: companionship, shared silence, a hand held not out of desire, but out of need. And sometimes that need felt like love, even if it wasn't. The collapse of judgment. With churches closed, judgment faded. Moral boundaries collapsed. Priests no longer heard confessions. Citizens no longer feared excommunication. Desperation replaced doctrine. And so intimacy, whether bought or borrowed, continued without consequence. People stopped asking if their acts were sinful. They asked only if they were safe. And when safety could not be guaranteed, they asked if their acts were worth the risk. Often, they decided they were. In the shadows of plague, intimacy shed its moral constraints, and survival became the only rule. Touch as proof of life. Above all, physical closeness became proof. A shared touch, a whispered word, a night beside someone breathing. These were not indulgences. They were evidence. Evidence that death had not yet claimed everything, that life, however brief, still stirred. And so, behind locked doors, intimacy endured, not as love, not as lust, but as survival. And in those moments, they felt something even history cannot explain, a fragile sense that, for one more night, they were not alone. Conclusion. So what did intimacy truly look like during the plague? It looked like routine. It looked like repetition. It looked like hands that hesitated, then reached out anyway. In brothels, in taverns, in homes, people sought each other, not for pleasure, not for romance, but for reassurance. Because in a world consumed by death, the quiet presence of another human being became the only comfort left. In the next section, we will step softly into the aftermath. Because when the plague ended, the intimacy it changed did not disappear. It lingered and reshaped cities long after the ash was swept from their streets. But that quiet reflection, dear listener, waits patiently in our final chapter.
When the plague passed, slowly, the carts stopped rolling, the streets were cleaned, the ash washed away. But something remained, because after years of death, silence, and desperation, life in medieval cities resumed, and yet it did not return to what it once was. Intimacy itself had changed, desire had shifted, and the quiet transactional routines of the plague did not disappear with the disease. They stayed. Today we ask, what happened when the doors reopened, when the priests returned, when the world demanded normality? And we find that the plague did more than kill. It rewrote the rules of closeness, and society never fully recovered. The routine did not end. During the plague, intimacy became routine. Husbands and wives negotiated closeness. Prostitutes cultivated regular clients. Taverns became spaces not of joy, but of quiet survival. When the plague ended, people did not simply return to spontaneity. Routine stayed. People preferred what they knew, the same clients, the same partners, the same conversations. Intimacy remained calculated, even after the fear faded. Desire had been transformed from passion into habit, and habit, once learned, is hard to break. Brothels became more normal. During the plague, brothels were legalized, taxed, and controlled. After the plague, cities saw no reason to reverse this. Controlled intimacy felt safer than uncontrolled desire. And so, across European brothels, permanent entities, roles shifted from indulgence to service, a public good, not a private shame. What had been temporary became structural.
And the women inside? Their labor became normalized, their transactions became routine, and their survival continued, not as scandal, but as society's quiet necessity. Emotional intimacy became private. Before the plague, emotions were shared in public. Marriages were communal. Festivals were collective. But the plague taught people fear, and fear taught people privacy. After the plague, intimacy moved indoors. Couples kept closeness to themselves. Friends gathered in smaller circles. Public joy felt dangerous, and for many, physical closeness, once a public expression, became private routine, not because they wanted it that way, but because survival had reshaped their instincts, and instincts, once changed, linger. The collapse of religious control. Before the plague, churches controlled bodies. Marriage was a sacrament, desire a sin, prostitution condemned. But during the plague, churches failed, priests fled, blessings stopped, and when people survived without them, they questioned whether they needed them. After the plague, moral rules loosened. People confessed less, feared sin less, and accepted transactions more. Desire became human, not divine, not demonic, just ordinary, and ordinary things are hard to control. Fear changed what pleasure meant. In the pre-plague world, pleasure was joy. After the plague, pleasure became proof, a reminder that life continued, that death had not yet won. And so, even when the plague ended, pleasure retained its new meaning. It was no longer indulgence, it was survival, a quiet affirmation that the world, however broken, still spun, and bodies, however tired, still reached for each other, not out of lust, not out of romance, but out of quiet need. What the plague truly changed, in the end, the plague did not kill desire, it changed it. And when the ash settled, medieval cities realized closeness was no longer spontaneous, intimacy was no longer public, brothels were no longer scandalous, pleasure was no longer joy. Bodies continued to meet, but hearts remained distant. Desire adapted to fear, and fear, even when gone, left its shadow. Conclusion: a changed world behind closed doors. And so, dear listener, when you imagine a medieval city after the plague, do not picture celebration, picture routine. Picture couples who no longer touched in the street. Picture brothels where women worked not in shame, but in monotony. Picture taverns where back rooms hummed with silent transactions. The plague rewrote survival, and in doing so, it rewrote desire, not into passion, but into habit, not into romance, but into comfort. And comfort in a world still haunted by death was enough. Thank you for joining this quiet journey. Sleep softly now, because history's strangest stories are often the ones whispered behind locked doors.